Israel has allowed trucks carrying fuel into Gaza as fears grow of spreading starvation and disease in the territory. Israel agreed to allow 2 trucks of fuel per day into Gaza after pressure from the United States and dire warnings from the United Nations about the humanitarian situation in the territory. The UN says the fuel deliveries are less than 10% of what's required for basic life-preserving measures. Many civilians in Gaza are struggling to find enough food and water to survive, with fuel desperately needed to power generators at bakeries and water desalination plants.
I'd like to now welcome Martin Frick, German director of the UN World Food Program. First of all, Martin, we in the media have been reporting for weeks now that an already dire situation is getting worse by the day. Tell us what you're hearing from your UN colleagues in Gaza.
Well, I can absolutely confirm the humanitarian situation in Gaza is disastrous. We are running out of everything, particularly fuel, as we have just heard. Now, there was a first shipment of fuel, which is a drop in the ocean, really, because it's less than 10% of what we actually would need a day just for life-saving measures.
The Gaza Strip is home, of course, to over 2 million people, and now it's a war zone. Thousands have been killed, tens of thousands injured. What's left of the food distribution infrastructure?
You can basically say that the local market collapsed. Everything that can be consumed without being cooked, everything canned, is basically run out. Bottled water is not available. The water sources that do exist, the wells, are often contaminated and present a health risk. So with the onset of winter on top of that, we are really afraid of starvation in Gaza.
Of course, we understand that fuel is finally getting through. You referenced that earlier, but I take it that you don't see this as all good news.
Well, fuel is desperately needed. Fuel is behind everything. It's behind the desalination of seawater, which is essential for the water supply. It's essential for pumping sewage, which is, vital for hygiene and for health, public health. But it's also vital for bakeries, for example, for mills. We still have about 9,000 tons of wheat in Gaza, but we can't use it because you can't mill it. And even if you can mill it, you would need water and energy to bake bread. We used to work together with 23 bakeries in Gaza. Not a single one is operational anymore. And bread, of course, is the most basic of all staple foods.
You said that the fuel that's going to be getting into Gaza is a drop in the ocean. How is it that aid agencies, such as the agency that you're working with, can bring more pressure to the Israeli government to get the kind of fuel that is essential for your operations?
Well, it's slowly starting. We now have an agreement to bring in 2 trucks a day, 2 trucks of diesel, which already helps, and it's desperately needed, particularly for the hospitals and for food supply. We could run for a bit of time as we have strategic reserves, but by 15th of November, our partner organization, UNRWA, has basically announced that without fuel, they have to stop every bit of humanitarian aid inside Gaza.
That is Martin Frick, German director of the UN World Food Program. Many, many thanks.
Thank you.
And we can now speak to Marina Miron. She is a military analyst at King's College in London. Marina, in the last few hours, hundreds of people have reportedly evacuated Gaza's largest hospital, the al-Shifa medical complex. It's a bit unclear now if the Israeli army actually ordered an evacuation, but why would Israel want people out of there, especially when for some patients, moving basically means dying?
Good day, Nick. Well, that's a good question, but we have to see it from a military perspective. And from a military perspective, it is an obstruction to the military operation to combating the hospital because there is always a danger that a civilian might be caught in crossfire. So in order to increase the speed of the operation, we know that the IDF has been combing the buildings of the hospital very slowly, also because of the presence of civilians, of patients in the hospital, it would make the military operation easier. And of course, we have heard the reports that the hospital doesn't have any electricity to operate any of its equipment. So in the long term, it might be more beneficial to evacuate the patients as far as possible in order for them to get proper treatment and increase the chances of survival.
And just to get to why the army is there, for weeks the Israeli Defense Forces have claimed there was an underground Hamas command center under hospitals. Now that they have taken over this hospital's grounds, how convinced are you by the evidence they've provided?
Well, I'm afraid it's not me who has to be convinced. I think Israel has created a lot of expectations on what we might be seeing in al-Shifa hospital. And the problem is that the IDF has not come through the entire complex. So right now, what is happening is that the evidence that the IDF has presented might not be considered as sufficient in order to justify IDF's operation in the hospital, because there is a difficult legal situation here. The IDF has to demonstrate indeed that Hamas is using this hospital to conduct their operations. That said, they have to demonstrate clearly that there are command headquarters of Hamas in this hospital, which would then allow Israel to operate on its territory, because otherwise this hospital is protected by the international humanitarian law. However, the expectation of what we're to see, what kind of command and control center, the Hamas is not a regular army, so you are not going to encounter a room full of computers. Okay. Therefore, it is possible that Israel will not be able to come up with sufficient evidence in order to support this claim, which will make the situation even more difficult for Israel.
And if we could, Marina, just shift our focus to the other part of the conflict. The Israeli army says its troops are targeting areas wherever Hamas exists, including in southern Gaza. How complicated will it be to limit civilian casualties if much of the Gazan population has actually fled south?
It is very difficult indeed, because Hamas would probably, even if they don't use humans as their shields, they might hide in densely populated areas. And then it will come down to the decision of the commanders on the ground whether to target those areas or not. So the idea is, does the military advantage outweigh the potential collateral damage that it's going to create, such a strike is going to create? And that is a very difficult decision, which you have to assess on a case-by-case basis. But it is to be expected that there will be collateral damage. However, the question here is not whether there will be collateral damage, but how much there will be.
Marina Miron, military analyst at King's College in London, thank you so much for those insights.
Thank you for having me.